Good morning, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Geoff Wilkinson. I'm Managing Director of Wilkinson Construction Consultants. We're licensed approved inspectors. My background is in building control. I've worked in both local authority and as an approved inspector since the early 1980s. It's a long time, way too long. And these kind of things we do quite regularly. For those of you that are already clients of ours, you'll know that we run something that we call a Brig Fast meeting, which is a meeting at about 9 o'clock sort of time, where we get people together. And as part of the service that we offer our clients, we basically offer probably every quarter a little CPD type event. And this is going to be based on that kind of concept. However, based on a lot of the discussion that's gone on before today, I think that this wider sort of webinar arrangement is going to prove quite popular, and we've certainly had a number of people that have expressed an interest in coming along to future events. So if there's stuff that we haven't covered today, or if you are interested in attending future events, if you can pop us an email, put your details in the questions and answers, get in contact somehow, then we'll make sure that you're registered for any of the future events that we'll be putting on. As far as today is concerned, our core focus is going to be on the building control and process aspects of all of the changes that were made in the run-up to the politicians going on holiday at the end of July. In particular, I'm going to be looking at some of the wider implications for building control. Now, there will be some people who perhaps are attending this that are specifically interested in some of the requirements for leaseholders or duty holders, or some of the things that may not be covered today. If they're not covered today, then as I say, I'm more than happy to put on another event that will be specifically covering that. But what we're looking at today, we're going to start off by looking at some of the documents that were released over the course of probably from about May to the end of July, because there were absolutely herds of the stuff. And we're going to be looking at that and how that's actually going to change the building control system and the way in which you currently work at the moment, because I can assure you there are some major changes and some things that you may not have picked up on. So I'm going to start that, and as I say, if anyone wants any of these documents, please just get in touch, either drop it in the Q&A or by email. We're going to start by touching on the manual to the building regs. Now, this was one of a series of documents that was produced towards that batch that were released with the building safety bill itself. And within that, it's a really important document. If you've never seen the old version of the manual, it's something that I personally have been crying out for to be updated for probably about 10 years or so now. The manual itself explains the building control process and how you actually go about getting building control approval, and it simplifies some of the understanding about what rules apply to what buildings and what types of buildings and what your options are. Now, in particular within that, there's a really handy section that starts to talk about the regulations as they apply to changes of use, and material alterations, because these are particularly important things that people regularly get wrong. They don't understand which parts of the approved documents apply to which types of projects that they're currently undertaking. And this can cause no end of problems. Now, alongside that, one of the reasons why I particularly mention that at this point in time is with the proposed changes to the planning regime as well. Now, what we've seen is the introduction of further relaxations for permitted development. So you've got your office to resi conversions, you've now got the ability to add extra stories on top of an existing building. Now, all of these will either fall under a material alteration or a material change of use, as well as being dealt with as an extension. Now, one of the things that a lot of people don't realise in amongst that is that that has implications on the existing building itself. I Don't know whether many people here have got involved with what I'll refer to as Airspace Developments. This is where you're adding additional stories of resi on top of an existing residential block. Now, these types of projects have often been misunderstood, quite often by building control themselves. And there are some very important implications to these kind of projects to ensure that you actually comply with the correct regulations. Now, what will frequently happen is by putting an additional story on the top, you'll be reusing the existing staircase as your principal means of escape route. Now, if you are doing that, then all of the lower floors would still need to comply with current standards. And invariably, a lot of the old blocks built 1960 or converted won't comply with those rules. So for a long time, we've had issues about how you deal with those flats on the lower floors, because the fire doors, for example, to one of the existing flats form part of the protection to the escape routes and for the fire service access to the top floor flats. Now, you may not be carrying out any work whatsoever within those particular parts of the development, but nonetheless, you're expected to at least provide the level of protection to that staircase as it continues all the way up. So that's one of the things that's kind of started to be addressed in the guidance document, frequently asked questions that the government put out, and also within the manual itself. Now, other things that are particularly important in that include disproportionate collapse and how that applies to that type of development. But perhaps more specific to today's discussion are the requirements that are coming in for sprinklers in buildings over 11 metres in height, the provision of wayfinding, so that's fire service access, and also what happens when you go above 18 metres and you start dealing with external wall construction. Now, in each of those cases, you are required to comply with the standard. Now, this will mean that you need to start looking at providing sprinklers within the existing floors. So if you've gone from a building that was below 11 metres in height previously and is now above 11 metres in height by virtue of adding the additional stories, then you'll need to look at sprinkling the whole building. Now, that it's an important point to note here that it's not the common parts that you're looking to sprinkle, it's the individual apartments themselves. The common area requirements, so the things that are dealing with, for example, the fire service access, so wayfinding, emergency lighting, etc., they'll all be expected, but they're reasonably practical for you to be able to physically get to because they're in the common parts. Bear in mind as well that, say, if you're taking the building over 18 metres, then if you have got any combustible construction on the external face of the building or an external wall build-up, then you would be expected to replace that in order to comply with the requirements and the non-combustibles ban, because the building previously didn't need to comply with those requirements and now does. So you can see how some of these implications start to really kick through. One of the other important pieces of documentation that was released in the run-up was a combined approved document. Now, what they've done here is they've taken all of the approved documents, all of the individual parts, given them a quick revamp and brought them up to date and style-wise as far as they can, and they've dropped them into one single volume document. Now, that is a huge document, and if you're asking me to send you a copy, I'll suggest that you download it yourselves from the website, because it won't go by email, and you'll even struggle with some of the Dropboxy type things to actually get that through as a single document. Why is that important? Well, it's important because it will now be a single document in a single place, and it will be harder or it'll be better, but it will help prevent people using the wrong version of the wrong document. So that helps to maintain the documents and actually keep them up to date. I presume that the hard copy version will effectively be a loose leaf document, which again is something we've ideally asked for a long time, so that when you're replacing an individual, when you need to replace or update, you can replace and update an individual page within that. For those of you that remember back in the good old days when we always used to have the hard copy ring binder type things, it was a lot easier to do it that way when you could just replace an individual page within that. So that is quite an important change. And if you haven't got the latest up-to-date versions of the approved documents, please go and find those and make sure that you are working to them. The next thing that was snuck through was a new guide to fire safety procedural guidance. For those of you that are perhaps not particularly familiar with this aspect, any building which is currently controlled under the Fire Safety Regulatory Reform or Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order does require a building control consultation with the fire service. And that has a statutory form, and that has a statutory requirement for building control to consult with the fire service. Now, what we haven't had is a consistent form for that. Now, the new procedural guidance actually sets out the way in which building control is expected to consult with the fire service, and this will mean far more detail being included within that consultation process. So what you're going to start seeing is building control bodies asking for you to supply information to them in that form so that they can pass it on to the fire service. Now, those of you that are currently dealing with the fire service, particularly the London Fire Service, will be aware of some of the issues that there are and some of the delays that there are in actually getting fire service consultations back. One of the problems is that there is no standard format, and in particular when we're trying to consult with the London Fire Service at the moment, we're getting no end of problems with getting the plans to them and for them to be able to check them, because they seem to be mostly working from home on IT that really isn't up to necessarily the grade. So hopefully this new consistent form will make life easier, because each fire service will then have one consistent method of dealing with it. But within that, it's worth bearing in mind that this is going to start to apply to all buildings and how we consult with them on all buildings. So you can expect that to come through. So that's just a brief overview of some of the other changes. I know the main reason that you've come along to today's webinar is to deal with the fire safety bill itself, and obviously that's what I'm going to focus on for the next half an hour or so. If there are, as I say, any particular questions that you want answered, or if there's anything that I'm not covering, if you can pop it into the Q&A section, then I'll see whether I can pick it up today. If not, we'll deal with it in one of the future webinars. Now, the first thing to point out is that fire safety bill itself is at this point just a bill. It's not an act yet. So it's not legislation, and it's going to take, I would think, probably 12 to 18 months to actually start progressing through the process of going through the House of Commons, going up to the House of Lords, coming back, and there'll be a series of amendments, and there's a whole chance of that the thing being amended during that point in time. So at the moment it's just being presented as a bill, and it's worth bearing that in mind, because there will be changes along the way. So it's important that you stay up to date with those changes. So please do keep in touch, keep coming along to these webinars, and make sure that you're involved in that. I should also point out that this will be the primary legislation. It will then create the ability and make amendments to other legislation. And it's probably when we get to those parts that we actually start dealing with the real detail and the real important parts. So again, as they start to kick through, you'll start to see how this thing will all come together in the longer term. One of the things that people may not have noticed is that the bill is proposing to amend the Building Act itself. So this means that a lot of the changes, or at least some of the changes within the proposals, will not only just apply to buildings that are in scope. I'll touch on the issue of what's in scope and what's not in scope and what might be in scope in a moment, but it will deal with all buildings. So the entire building control system is going to change, and there are some very fundamental changes within that. And that is obviously going to be one of the main things that we're going to be talking about. So let's just start with where we think in scope is actually going to be. At the moment, we're talking about buildings that are 18 metres in height or more than 6 stories in height. That's the criteria that Dame Hackett originally set out. But there's a lot of pressure at the moment to extend that to a wider range of buildings. Now, these can be other buildings that are over 18 metres but are not residential in nature, so hospitals, schools, and other buildings with sleeping risks, potentially even hotels, and also buildings that are under 18 metres in height. And we've already seen the criteria extended for sprinklers in residential buildings down to buildings of 11 metres in height. So you can see how we're not yet fixed on the fact that it's going to be buildings, residential buildings over 18 metres in height, which includes obviously mixed use buildings. So if you've got literally a flat within one of these buildings, potentially you're caught by this in any case. So a lot of people are actually thinking to themselves, well, it doesn't really bother me because this is only going to apply to huge, great tower blocks. And frankly, I don't deal with huge, great tower blocks. But it isn't as simple as that, because a lot of the changes, as I say, if you actually, here's a really good tip. If you go onto the document itself, search the PDF and use the term all buildings. And this will start to highlight some of the clauses that apply, shockingly, to all buildings. Now, some of these are really quite wide-ranging. For a start, it creates the building safety regulator as being the body overall in charge. So at the moment, you've got a section within the Department of Communities or Ministry of Communities, Homes and Local Government, who are responsible for writing the regs, for dealing with any disputes that there may be, and to deal with the system as a whole. That is all going to be replaced by the building safety regulator, and this is primarily going to be sitting or being led by the health and safety executive, and we'll touch on that a bit more in a moment. But the building safety regulator will have a range of responsibilities that actually go beyond those that the department currently have. So it's going to be looking at things like replacing BRAC. Now, for those of you that have never heard of BRAC or what the hell BRAC is the Building Regulations Advisory Committee. It's a group of the great and the good from within building control and associated professions who advise the government on what the regulations should actually look like. And typically over a period of years, they've advised that every time there's a major incident, this needs to be done, or on the back of current research, this needs to be done. All of that function is now going to be performed by the building safety regulator itself. So it will have the powers to determine where the regulations are actually going. It will obviously listen and advise ministers and push them in the right direction, but it will be a complete replacement for BRAC. One of the other things that it will do is it will look at the actual guidance documents. So all the guidance documents, the manual, all of the approved documents and any other guidance documents that are out there will all be produced effectively by the building standards regulator. On top of that, they will also be looking at competency, and this is going to be one of the main areas that I'm going to deal with in the webinar this morning, really looking at the issue of competency as a whole, and I'll come to that as it applies to probably the majority of you in a moment. But in particular, they'll also be responsible for building control body licensing. Now, this is quite interesting from my perspective because I'm currently a building control body. I am a building inspector. Now, what is going to happen is that all of the building control bodies will effectively be licensed by this new body, which is a big change from the way that we are at the moment. Approved inspectors are licensed by the Construction Industry Council and have to go through a process of obtaining a license and renewing that every 5 years. Local authorities don't have to do that. And to a degree, under the new system, they'll still not have to do that. But they will have to prove their competency nonetheless. So although they will still be, by their nature, the default building control body, so if no one else is there to provide building control for you, there will always be the local authority. But the local authority will still need to employ qualified building inspectors. So what will happen under the new system is that building control officers such as myself will need to obtain a qualification that's accepted by the building standards regulator, and we will need to prove that and prove that over time. In the event that we mess up for any reason, then that license would be potentially removed from us. So it's a real toughening of the rules as they currently stand. Now, interestingly, if the person within the local authority who has the qualification leaves, for example, or for whatever reason the local authority can't get someone, potentially they can outsource that to a qualified building inspector. But ultimately, a qualified building inspector will be required to sign off on every project that there is. Now, this will, as I say, really start to affect building control bodies and the way in which they operate, because you will need to have one of these qualified building control officers actually signing off work. A lot of the smaller work that perhaps we're dealing with at the moment could be signed off by someone who is not yet qualified, so an associate or potentially even someone at a trainee grade if it's a simple enough project. The idea of the new system will be that only qualified building inspectors can actually sign the final certificate or the sign-off. It would need to be someone that's qualified, always overseeing these things. So that's something that needs to be borne in mind, particularly for the building control bodies themselves. This, for example, could affect the pricing structure of fees that you're paying at the moment if they're not currently being signed off by someone that's qualified. One of the things that is really driven home throughout the whole of the Building Safety Bill is the issue of competency. And this is one of the areas, again, that's going to apply to all buildings. I don't really want to be quoting clause numbers throughout the whole of this webinar, but I'm going to do it on this occasion. Clause 39 is one to look out for. Now, this is the one that builds on the existing CDM rules, and in particular deals with the issue of writing into building regulations requirements for responsibilities for principal designer and principal contractor. And this is one of those that say that's not just applying to the high-rise buildings, this is applying to all buildings that go through the building control process. So this could be something simple, potentially as a domestic extension. It could be pretty much any project. So if you currently work with fit out and you're doing the fit out design, you will be forming the role of principal designer for the purposes of the building regulations and CDM. And what's important here is that it's going to be a requirement that you meet certain standards of competency. Now, at the moment, this is up for grabs in terms of what the competency level will actually be. Now, there's some work being done by British Standards at the moment to see whether there's a common competency framework that could be used. But you can expect that as we move forwards, individual organisations, RIBA, CIOB, etc., could all put together their own competency frameworks within that, and they will effectively assess the competency of people. If you are a client, you will be expected to appoint a competent person. And then once you've taken on, let's assume that we're following the traditional design method, you've appointed an architect to be the first port of call, if you like, then they will be responsible also for assessing the competency of the contractor. And then as you move down the line, so the contractor will be responsible for assessing the competencies of the subcontractors, and so on and so forth. Now that becomes quite an onerous requirement. It really builds on the current sort of CDM rules, and we're yet to see exactly whether there will be minimal bars, so perhaps domestic extensions will be exempt from some of this. But it's worth, as I say, bearing in mind the new tie between the building regulations and these roles. Now, one of the things that is frequently discussed is, well, I am the lead architect on this job, but I don't really have the health and safety qualification. So what I'll do is I'll appoint somebody else as a principal designer. they're not a principal designer. For the purposes of this, and one of the things I think that Dame Hackett really wants to get across is that the person who does the design is the principal designer. Now, what you can do for the purposes of principal designer is that you can share the competencies within an organisation, for example, and you can then have a health and safety expert within that. But ultimately, the designer is the person that's responsible. So if you are a single person, that's what you're taking on. If you're an organisation, then you can have someone within your organisation who is the expert in health and safety, or the expert in building regs, or the expert in whatever else it is that you need in order to be able to carry out the work. So, for example, if you are carrying out work on a high-rise building, you would need to be able to demonstrate your experience and competency working on a high-rise building. So there is potentially an immediate break there for anyone who hasn't worked on that particular type of work before. So if you haven't, you would have to demonstrate how and why you think that you are competent to take this project on. What's particularly important within the whole of this discussion is that under these rules, a breach will become a criminal offence under the building regulations. At the moment, under Section 35, it's very difficult for any building control body to actually take a case against anyone. It's very rare that you see either a Section 35 or a Section 36 notice, which are the two areas under which building control can actually take enforcement. As an approved inspector, we can't take enforcement anyhow, and only the local authorities can do that. But the new building standards regulator will be able to do this. And based on the fact it's the HSE, I expect very much that they will. And I expect very much that during the early days of implementation, this is going to be at the forefront of what they're going to do. Now, how do we see them actually going about that kind of enforcement process? For those of you that have been along to one of my talks before, I've mentioned something which I refer to as the Mario Minchella case. Now, this was a case where an architect was working effectively on a care home, which was timber framed, and had taken no account of the fact that it was timber frame that they were designing. And then they just handed the design onto the principal contractor for them to consider all of the fire safety aspects in construction. So although they'd got building control approval for it, there's the halfway sound as the chimes go off in the background. So they'd been responsible, and they'd actually got building control approval, and the end building was actually compliant. But what happened in this particular case was they made no consideration whatsoever of the construction phase fire risk issues. Now, as a result of that, the health and safety executive inspector went down to site. They spotted that this was a timber frame building, and they asked for a copy of the designer's risk assessment covering the risk. There wasn't one in place whatsoever. It'd just been handed over to the principal contractor for them to carry out. And the principal designer, the architects, small firm, 5 or 6 architects, so it wasn't a huge corporate or anything. They weren't particularly making a point of chasing those down, were prosecuted, and they were fined. And that the basis for that was that the health and safety executive considered that there was a serious flaw in the design because they hadn't considered the during construction phase. So you can see how the health and safety executive are likely to go about dealing with this, and bearing in mind that the health and safety executive are going to be the lead regulator. So it's going to be very much a case of, you show me how you've complied with these requirements. Show me how you've considered these risks. Show me how you've addressed those risks. And if you haven't, then you are going to find yourself the wrong side of an enforcement case. And I think one of the things that needs to be pointed out as well within this is that whilst these are typically in the past dealt with when it's a corporate body, as a case against the corporate body, that the wording of the fire safety, the Building Standards Bill as it stands at the moment, references the fact that individual directors can be liable. In the same way, individual building inspectors that sign stuff off if they are the person that's actually physically signed it off, potentially they can be liable as well. So it's going to create a whole new range of liabilities. And I'm not even going to get into building standards or building safety manager or any of the others for the purposes of today and what's going on there. But you will start to see some huge implications on responsibility and liability for individuals and corporate bodies as we move forwards. Now, that whole thing starts to run into some real issues for organisations and their PI. And again, that's probably one to debate on another day. Whilst I'm on the subject of enforcement, it's perhaps worth also mentioning that under the new system, there'll be, as part of the enforcement regime, there'll be a series of stop notices. There'll be powers to suspend work. There'll be powers to suspend or remove building control bodies from the register of licensed bodies. There'll be effectively an ability for them to stop anyone who they consider to not be competent from trading. One of the biggest issues, obviously, is for buildings that are in scope. Under that regime, you have to apply to the Building Standards Regulator. Now, the Building Standards Regulator means that you will no longer have choice in who you appoint. So at the moment, you've got the choice of using the local authority or an approved inspector. That choice is going to be removed from any building which is in scope. Now, at the moment, we're talking about buildings over 18 metres in height that contain residential work. But bear in mind that that's not just new build, that's refurbishment, that's alteration. It's anything that is done to any of those buildings which is in scope. Now, for example, let's just give a fairly common example. If you are an interior designer, for example, and you're doing some internal refurbishment work to a flat, you might be moving some petitions about, you will need to go through this process and you will need to apply to the Building Standards Regulator for your approvals. Now, that's very different from the situation at the moment, whereby you're applying through an approved inspector or through the local authority. And I'll deal with, actually, well, I'll go straight into this now. So let's just look at what the new process for approvals will actually be. So what we're going to have is a series of 3 gateways. The first gateway will be at the planning stage. So when you're making a planning application, you will have to include, if you're working on an in-scope building, a set of fire safety information that sets out the fire safety strategy for that building. Those of you that are working on blocks under the London plan at the moment may well already have experienced a request to supply a copy of the fire safety strategy for that building. So you're going to have to see, you have to engage with a fire engineer or someone else that you feel that's competent in order to put that fire strategy together before you get planning consent. Okay. Now, the Building Standards Regulator will consult with the fire service. So, for example, they might look at water supply to the building. They might look at fire service access to the building. Now, if you're carrying out refurbishment work to an in-scope building, for example, let's say you are going to carry out some work to reclad the building, how does that affect the fire service access to that building? If you're putting scaffolding all the way around it, during the course of the work, you might be shutting off roads, there might be road closures, you might be looking at where you can store materials, etc. All of those things potentially need to be factored into where you're going from a planning perspective, because all of those can affect the fire service access. So you're going to have to start putting together a lot more thought about how the fire safety aspects will be incorporated before you get anywhere near the site, before you've even got planning permission. So it's worth bearing that in mind, because that brings forward a lot of the design elements to it, and it certainly means you're going to need to engage with building control and fire safety bodies a lot earlier than you currently do. Now, obviously, a lot of projects that you're dealing with may well be outside of the planning regime, and in which case you don't have gateway number 1. So if you are doing some internal refurbishment work, for example, or it's permitted development, maybe it's office to resi, something like that, then potentially you're outside of the planning regime, so you wouldn't be required to do any of that work on those occasions. The next step is aligns basically at the moment with the full plans application stage. Now, this will mean that you need to submit full plans to the Building Standards Regulator and get effectively a full plans building control approval, at least on all of the fire safety elements that go into the building. So you will have to have thought about in some detail the fire alarm, fire doors, construction, materials, smoke control, pretty much emergency lighting. All of these things will feed into the full plans application. Why is this important? Because you cannot commence work on site until you have that approval in your hand. It will be an offence to start work on site before you have that approval in your hand. Now, the level of detail that's going to be required for that approval is yet to be determined, but you can expect it's going to be in some detail at the very least. I don't think you're going to be allowed to just leave until the final subcontractor comes along towards the end of the project to actually have come up with what the smoke alarm system is going to be or what your smoke vents are going to be. So you're going to have to probably have CFD modelling, for example, dealt with at this stage before you commence work on site. If you haven't got that in place, the Building Standards Regulator is unlikely to be satisfied that you have in place everything that you need to have in place, and will ensure that you are not allowed to start work on site. So I think you really need to start thinking about how that will apply to any of your projects. Now, bear in mind that at the moment we're saying that in scope is only dealing with buildings over 18 metres. If you look at the Fire Safety Bill, which is a separate piece of legislation, this also starts to talk about, and I mentioned earlier, about the Fire Safety Procedural Guidance. There is a strong view that any building to which the RRO applies, which essentially is common areas of blocks of flats, and pretty much any building other than a single family dwelling, will need to go through this approach. It's one that personally I've campaigned for a long time, that you cannot start work until you have a fire strategy in place. Now, as I say, if you're thinking about doing some fit out work regularly, you will end up with some plans and you'll be wanting to start quickly. You'll need to have gone through that process. And if it's an in-scope building, you will end up having to go through the Building Standards Regulator, which will definitely slow down the approvals process overall. In fact, one of the big questions that we're going to have is how the hell are they going to cope with the volume of work that's actually been coming forwards? And that's perhaps something we can address either in some Q&A in about 5-10 minutes time, or we can look at in a future webinar, because it's not quite as simple as you might first think. We're not talking here about 2Ping, transfer of undertakings of permanent employment, local authority staff into the Building Standards Regulator. We may well be talking about that for the people that work up at the Communities and Local Government Department being transferred across, but we're not talking about that within the individual local authorities. So at some point, in addition to the health and safety people who will be moving across, I'm sure, you will need to recruit in some building control experience, some fire experience, and some enforcement experience to try and assist the Building Standards Regulator and actually being able to deal with these. So I think it's unbelievable the number of barriers that there are now going to be by removing the element of choice that's being proposed here. Now, as I say, this can extend to very minor works. For example, you could be doing something as simple as a rewire within a kitchen, within a flat, within a block that's over 18 metres, or you could be looking at putting in air conditioning or something of that kind. Now, potentially, these are all covered under the competent person schemes at the moment, and the individual contractor self-certifies. That notification will still need to go to the Building Standards Regulator because it's an in-scope building, and it won't be as simple as them basically just turning up and doing the work. The Building Standards Regulator will still have the ability, even though it's under a competent person scheme, to insist that they inspect some of the work. So they may well, based on past experience of the way the HSE work, they may well want to just do some random inspections. They may wait for June to come along, and then they'll say, right, for the period of June, we're going to do a series of inspections on all the notifications of competent person schemes in scope buildings. And then they will do an audit of all of those, and they will go around and they will specifically look at that from an enforcement perspective. So you can see how that starts to deliver in. One of the, so that takes us on to having completed this, we come to the final stage of the golden thread. Have I mentioned the golden thread? How could I possibly have missed the golden thread? So Dame Hackett talks about throughout the whole of her report about something called the golden thread. So it's the concept that the information that starts off at the planning application transfers all the way through to occupation. And occupation, or handover of the building completion, is in fact gateway number 3. Now, the important thing here is that you cannot occupy until you've got that building control sign off at the end of the project. So let's just assume that you're desperate to hand over 2 or 3 floors of the building. If the fire safety works within the building are incomplete, and we've certainly seen that before, how will you get sign off for those 2 or 3 floors? The answer is you probably won't. You will need to satisfy them that everything that's within the common areas that relate back to the fire safety of the building overall are in place before you occupy the building. So that's been a fairly fast run through of the sort of core points within the process, and that's so what I've really been focused on at the moment. So just quickly running through, we've got a question: will there be a period of grandfather rights? Not sure I entirely understand what's meant by grandfather rights. What I think is probably being thought of here is a transitional period. If I'm wrong, can you please just type in and explain what you mean by grandfather rights, and I'll pick up on that. But the question about transitional period, effectively, you are going to have something called the building safety case, which is something I really want to deal with in one of the future ones of these. But all buildings, even though they have been completed under previous legislation, so projects that you're currently in the process of doing at the moment that are going through the building control system and will be handed over and occupied possibly after this is in place, you will still need to be putting in place a building safety case. And as I say, that's something that I'm intending to do a whole nother seminar on, a whole nother webinar. So if that is what you mean, then let me know and we'll get another one organised on that. Are there going to be any changes as to how a building control body is appointed? The quick answer to that is yes. You won't be able to appoint the building control body if it is a in-scope building. You will only be able to go to the building standards regulator. If it is a situation where you are out of scope, then one of the things that you need to bear in mind is that you, as principal designer, if you're making that decision, then you need to also look at the competencies of the building control body in the same way that you would look at the competencies of anybody else. So let's take, for example, the fact that, let's say we're dealing with a theatre. Okay, you've landed a project and you're dealing with a theatre. Has the building control body that you're looking to appoint got experience of working with theatres? If they haven't, how can you justify going to that particular building control body? In the same way as if you're looking to go to a contractor that isn't familiar with working in theatres. So the responsibility effectively cascades down from the first appointment in. Whoever takes on that role is then expected to look at the competencies of everyone beneath them. And there will be a framework and there will be guidance to help you do that. But throughout the whole of the process, you should always be thinking about not just what's the price, which is often the way in which building control gets appointed, but are they competent to deal with this particular type of project? The next question I've got, and please add some more on if you want. You've said that the movement of the bill will take 18 months to 2 years. The building regulator will be required to set up numerous local and national departments to get this work approved. So I cannot see the situation being resolved for at least another 5 years or longer before it becomes efficient. Yes, there's definitely a run-in period on this. But one of the things that Dame Hackett has said throughout the whole of this is that the industry shouldn't wait for the legislation to come before you start to adopt it. Now, there's a subtext threat here that when it does come along, it will be implemented quite hard as soon as it's in place. Now, bear in mind that at the moment, we have, I think they're referring to it officially as the shadow building standards regulator. But basically there is a test bed at the moment. There are already projects that are going through the concept of approval in this way. And as I said, although this may well take 18 months, 2 years to get through, 5 years by the time it's fully implemented and starts to work efficiently, there are other changes that potentially can be brought in quicker. So for example, the discussion about whether or not works, you could reasonably easily amend the Building Act to say that works cannot commence on any project until you have an approved plan in place. So that would be a much quicker process to put in place, and that would enable approved inspectors and local authorities to start working towards this kind of thing. Grandfather rights, okay, fine. So grandfather rights in this particular case referring to the fact that someone qualified today, any changes to future requirements would be nullified, your current qualification carries through. No. I'm pretty sure that the way in which this is going to be applied is very much not that. The anticipation, I'm sure, will be that there will be new qualifications in place, and the fact that you have been dealing with the project for 20, 30 years without that qualification, I cannot see the way that this is currently being set up allowing you basically to continue in practice. So if you have been doing it for 20 or 30 years and you don't fancy going through a new qualification process, I'll be very surprised if you're going to be able to practice beyond that. I appreciate how incredibly unfair that is, but based on my experience of CSCS cards and all the rest of it that's gone on, I cannot see the HSE organised body in particular working on that. In-scope buildings, you go to Building Standards Regulator and suggest a local authority inspector or an approved inspector. Is that right? No, that is not right. What happens is you go to the Building Standards Regulator and you apply to the Building Standards Regulator. You don't nominate your chosen inspector and they agree it or don't agree it. At the moment, it will be the Building Standards Regulator that is the authority for that. Now, what you can potentially do is you could appoint an approved inspector. They won't be an approved inspector for the purposes of this, as being your expert to guide you through the process itself. Now, this is quite an interesting process because, as I say, effectively, the approval will come from the Building Standards Regulator. Now, they could themselves, if they don't have sufficient resource or competency, look to effectively outsource that. And that's one of the things that really concerns me about the way in which this is being put together. Because the last thing that we need here is a building standards regulator body being set up, removing approved inspectors, removing local authority inspectors from the process, and then handing the thing over to some huge conglomerate. We've seen them before. I won't name the organisations concerned, who offer up a range of functions to local authorities or to the government, and end up winning those contracts pretty much because of the size of the particular organisation. So that's something that I'm incredibly concerned about. If they, on a particular case by case, can go, well, actually, we don't have the competencies. This is a relatively simple project. We're happy to hand it over to this improved inspector or to that local authority inspector. Then that would seem to be a sensible way of doing it. But there's nothing in anything I've seen at the moment that suggests it is going to be that. And as I say, the thing that worries me in particular is that we'll end up with a, I'll mention one, capita type organisation running the whole thing on behalf of the government. And if that's the case, we'll probably need to go and have a word with Mr. Cummings to see whether we can get relationships in place in order to be that approved body. Competency has been a major requirement of CDM since 2007, so it's nothing new. 2015 regulations make that clear. You must have necessarily ignored it. Yes, the quick answer to that is yes, it has indeed been one of the requirements of CDM. One of the things that we haven't seen is really an effective enforcement of that. If anyone has a different experience of that, by all means, let me know. But certainly in my experience, the competency issue hasn't been there. And also competency has been, it's been brushed around. So are you really competent? And a long involved discussion to be had about what competency actually is and isn't. And qualification is not competency, in my opinion. I've certainly seen a lot of people who have qualifications to the name, but are frankly still not competent to be let anywhere near some of these more complex projects. So it, as was quite rightly said here, you need to have knowledge, ability, training and experience. So you need to have all of those together. It's not something as simple in my mind as a qualification. Okay, let's have an interesting comment there that I will not repeat. Under CDM, it's written that a person in control of the design is principal, and that cannot be farmed out to an outside consultant, but it is. So is this closing a loophole? I believe the intention is that it is exactly intended to close that loophole. We cannot end up with a situation where it's just farmed out to another person. Again, within the document, it says that the principal designer must design. So you cannot have there's no way I can read it as being anything different to that. You cannot have a situation where you have a health and safety consultant advising on health and safety and a designer who is the principal designer not doing design. The principal designer designs. They may be advised by a consultant health and safety person, but the person who is the principal designer and will be held responsible under this legislation is the principal designer. It's the architect. It's almost certainly, in most cases, the architect. Some projects obviously are principally structural and you get the structural engineer on board first. But effectively, the first person that starts doing design and then hands out or helps bring other designers on board, they are the principal designer. I think that's the list of questions that I've got up. Oh, hang on. Following up on the capita point, then how do AI's local authority inspectors get commissioned for in-scope buildings? No, they don't get commissioned. Basically, they don't get commissioned for in-scope buildings. The Building Standards Regulator will be the body that does that. What then happens is if the Building Standards Regulator feel that they need to bring on help because they don't have the qualifications and experience themselves, then they can look to outsource that to some other organisation to help bring them up to the necessary standards. At the moment, I haven't seen anything that suggests that they have the right to forcibly take staff over, but it wouldn't surprise me if that somewhere appears within it. So effectively, they can forcibly take some staff from the local authority or from the fire service or whoever, if necessary. At the moment, one of my biggest concerns is how on earth this thing will be resourced, because we're creating a massive organisation that has responsibility for dealing with appeals, has responsibility for determining what the future regulations will be, has responsibility for writing the regulations, it has responsibility way beyond anything that anyone does at the moment. They'll be responsible for auditing all of the building control bodies, for example. Well, At the moment, just dealing with the approved inspectors, the Construction Industry Council has a board of approved inspectors. I'm one of those that sit on the board of people that go out and actually do some of the audits of other approved inspectors. So you can see just how huge this is required to be. If there are 100 approved inspectors and you're going to spend 2 to 3 days auditing each, that's a year's worth of work before you start just dealing with that aspect. So how are you going to deal with that and do the research and deal with the writing of the documents and dealing with the appeals and dealing with all the day-to-day process? So this is going to be a huge organisation if it's going to have everything in-house. And where are these people actually going to come from? We can't assume that approved inspectors will go, you know what, I'm going to leave my practice and I'm going to go and work for this wonderful government body and run it there. So this is why I say I'm particularly concerned about this ending up being outsourced. And I think when we're talking to politicians and when we're developing this over the course of future months, and in particular if you can get involved with any of your professional bodies to ensure that the consultation responses go into them, if you can raise that, I think that's a very important point. We're coming to the end of the time that we've got allocated for this morning's webinar. I think it's thrown up some very useful questions, and I think there's a lot there that we can look to address in future webinars as well, if that's something that would interest people. So if you haven't already, if you can send your details through, contact me by email. My email is geoff@thebuildinginspector.org. Top of the screen, you'll see thebuildinginspector.org. It's all one word. Geoff is Geoff. Fire that through. I think you've probably on the invitation already got a link to do that in any case. Hopefully that's sort of whetted your appetite. As I say, the intention will be that we'll be running a number more of these and looking at some of the other aspects, in particular responsibilities, how we're dealing with existing buildings, and the all-important question about who pays for a lot of this. So they're subject for future events. If you did want to get in touch with me, either with questions or suggestions for future events, please let me know. If you are wanting a CPD certificate, again, please get in touch and we'll get one of those organised for you. For those of you that have been, I thank you for listening. I've been Geoff Wilkinson and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you very much.